So that's just the cover picture. This is Kettle Island, the place that is the subject of tonight's conversation. Um, One of the things I guess I want to get across about this place is that it is enormous. It is a huge island, the third largest island in the Ottawa River. And it's right in the midst of the urban area, but it's actually probably not that familiar to many people in this region. I know that there will be many people who are old enough to remember a time when Kettle Island was a kind of a cottage paradise, but that goes back to before the 1960s. And so, nature has reclaimed this place from a time when it was inhabited by, many people over many generations, but it's now a wild space. And so that's part of what's fascinating about this is that today it's completely uninhabited. Basically, if you go into a Kettle Island, what you're going to get is poison ivy and mosquitoes. But there was a time when this was a very lively center of attention in Canada's capital, and that's the story I want to talk about. And I'll tell you how I got there. So this is the sort of satellite image of looking down on Ottawa-Gatineau, and it situates Kettle Island and gives you a sense, for one thing, of its scale. It's a big place. And of course, we all know the name Kettle Island because it recurs in Ottawa politics as a very controversial place. It has been eyed as a potential launching point, I guess, for a bridge that would, a sixth interprovincial bridge that would connect Ottawa and Gatineau. And so it has frequently over the years become a subject of much contention. It isn't so much the island that's contentious, it's the proposed bridge and the traffic concerns that would be created. Of course, the bridge itself is meant to be a traffic solution. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a sec. But of course, there would be implications and impacts of building that bridge. But that is essentially what sparked my interest. And then I got thinking, well, what the heck is Kettle Island and what's its story? And so that's where I began. So you will see throughout this presentation a number of headlines from news stories in the Ottawa Citizen and elsewhere, capturing moments in the controversy around Kettle Island and the proposed bridge. So I'm leading up to how I got interested in the subject. In 2013, Kettle Island was once again identified by the NCC, the National Capital Commission, as the place where we should build a sixth interprovincial bridge. At the time, it caused, yet again, because this has come up many times over many decades, it caused a huge controversy. And in fact, the city of Ottawa and many of its citizens objected to the proposed plan. And as that headline indicates at the bottom there, the proposed Kettle Island Bridge was nixed in 2013, despite the fact that significant voices within the community, including, as you can see in that editorial from the Ottawa Citizen, Build the Bridge, a lot of people supporting the idea of building a bridge across Kettle Island to connect Ottawa and Gatineau in the east end of the conjoined cities, if you like. More headlines. So this was in 2013. That was the last significant moment, I guess, in the story of the Kettle Island Bridge controversy, until a year ago, a year and a half ago now, I guess, when the federal budget identified a need, once again, for an interprovincial bridge. I should say identified a need controversially, because the federal government's suggestion that there needs to be a sixth interprovincial bridge was quickly objected to by a number of stakeholders, including, in fact, Ottawa Mayor Jim Watson, and Gatineau, and the Gatineau mayor, and other politicians. At the same time, Catherine McKenna, who many of you will know is the Ottawa Centre MP, expressed support for the idea of a sixth interprovincial bridge. And of course, the 2013 controversy, iteration of the controversy, had identified Kettle Island as the most appropriate place for that bridge. So once again, all eyes were on Kettle Island. The reason over and over again why an East End bridge across the river has been pushed mainly by the National Capital Commission, but also by others over the years, is the scene that we all know from the corner of King Edward Avenue and Rideau Street, which is a tangle of big trucks making their way through the city, fairly close to Parliament Hill. And basically, the whole King Edward truck route has been a blight on the urban area of the national capital. And there has been a feeling for many, many years that this needs to be corrected. And the solution frequently cited, and of course, which is ultimately the justification for the East End interprovincial bridge, is routing the traffic over to Gatineau before it gets downtown. And that's what that's essentially the main reason for this repeated effort to create momentum for an interprovincial bridge across Kettle Island. Nevertheless, just like every other time this idea got raised, it created a controversy in 2019 and ultimately was and is still being debated one more time by politicians and communities within Ottawa-Gatineau. So that was what started getting me interested in this subject. And then earlier this year, in June, the National Capital Commission released a report that once again looked at the various options for an interprovincial bridge. And what emerged from that process was essentially that there have been a few changes since 2013, but essentially, if you were to add up all of the different factors in terms of traffic impacts, environmental issues, and other, Kettle Island would still be probably the #1 choice in terms of the best site for a bridge. At the same time, before I get myself into hot soup here with many advocates of a different vision, there's lots of controversy about whether we even need a sixth interprovincial bridge. And part of that is that there are other transportation objectives that have come to the fore even since 2013. And obviously, we have an LRT system. We have potential other linkages between Gatineau and Ottawa, which have become topics of hot discussion amongst various players in the city. And so the idea of a Kettle Island bridge is still there. It's still one of the options on the table, but it is very much contested by many people. So out of all this, I got really interested in figuring out, well, what is the backstory of Kettle Island? We've all heard about it because it's this controversy over a potential bridge, but I got interested in the place and its backstory. And one of the things, this is a Google satellite image that I used to calculate the length of the island, which is actually quite a bit over 3 kilometers long. That's a big landform in the city. You can see that it's located, north of New Edinburgh and the Aviation Parkway and the Canada Aviation and Space Museum. And on the other side of the river, on the Gatineau side, which is at the top of the screen, You can see that there's the Tecumseh Golf Club to the sort of left end of the island. That's the green space there. And the idea of a bridge would be that it would connect the Aviation Parkway, Sir Georges Etienne Parkway, that kind of nexus there, across the island, and then connecting to the Monte Paiement, the road which is at the left side of the golf course, that green space on the other side of the river, and heading on up to Highway 50. So it would be a linkage between Highway 50 on the Quebec side and Highway 417 on the and 174 on the south side of this picture that you can't see. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the place. It's traditionally been presumed that Kettle Island was named Kettle Island because it is in close proximity, fairly close proximity to Chaudière Falls. Chaudière Falls, of course, being the French term for kettle falls. And so there was this sense that there was an association here between the two places. It may be true, but in my own research, I came up with an alternative which had been proposed, in fact, more than proposed, it was stated flatly by William Pittman Lett, who is an enormously significant figure in 19th century Ottawa. Many of you will know. He was the clerk of the city of Ottawa for many years, several decades in the 1800s, and was kind of a historian of the city during that century. And as he describes here, and now I just have to kind of change up my screen here a little bit so I can read. As he explains here, when voyagers and immigrants pitched their tents when they were moving up and down the Ottawa River, they were cooking their dinner on, quote, Kettle Island, from which circumstance it derived its name. In other words, you would look across from the mainland, from the shore on the Ottawa side, and you would see people with a big kettle hanging over a fire, cooking stuff. And that was William Pittman Lett's understanding of how Kettle Island got its name, that it didn't have to do with Chaudière Falls and the Chaudière Islands upstream, but in fact was named for this scene that people in Ottawa could vividly observe from the shore. This is me setting off to Kettle Island to research and write the story that I ended up producing for the Ottawa Citizen. That it was published in early October, and it was a pretty extensive piece in the end. 4,000 words or something like that. And it's because I just found out so much about the past of this place that was surprising to me. And I knew it would be surprising to many people in the city. And of course, as a journalist, that's kind of what you're looking for, is to, shed light on something people don't know much about. So off I went to Kettle Island. This is me embarking from a place along Rue Jacques Cartier in Gatineau and heading over to the island, which is only about, a few hundred meters from the shore. It's not like I was sailing across the Atlantic here. It took me about 5 minutes, I think, to paddle over to the island. So as much as I dressed it up as a big odyssey, it was really not much. But there's some interesting sights along the way. This is, I don't know what that is. Somebody here will know. That's either part of someone's deck or maybe a deck chair. I don't know what, but it's hung up in a tree because, as we all know, the Ottawa River in the past few years has had tremendous flooding. And this, piece of furniture or dock or whatever got stuck up a tree, pretty high up actually, in one of the latest spring floods. And so it's a sign actually of why the island itself is no longer habitable, because after the building of the Carillon Dam in the 1960s, flooding at too high a level on the island made it impossible for people to maintain cottages in that area, and they were all bought out by Hydro-Quebec, and that kind of ended the era of habitation on the island. So this is me parking my canoe, reaching the island. I guess I've parked my canoe because I must have been taking this picture. And I'm looking, in this case, north towards the Gatineau shore. This is a view looking west up the river. And you can see to the far left of this image, the New Edinburgh Boathouse off to the left. So that gives you some orientation about where Kettle Island is. And this is the west end of the island. It's one of the places where there's a kind of a beach that canoeists and people driving ski-doos, no, what do you call them? Sea-doos, and lots of people parking their boats and stuff, hanging out, sunning, having a picnic on this beachy spot at the west end of the island. Oh, and that's me on the west end of the island taking a selfie, just so I proved I made it all the way there across those many, many meters of water. So one of the things you encounter on the island is a big sign indicating that this place is now a nature reserve. The island is 98% owned by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. People here will know that it's one of the most important conservation groups in the country. The way it works is that it works with private and public partners to purchase and preserve in perpetuity what it considers to be important natural spaces. And in 2013, no, actually, I guess it was before 2013, some years before that, the Nature Conservancy of Canada purchased the remaining rights to Kettle Island. There are a few sort of stray bits of property that are not part of the Nature Conservancy's ownership, but 98% of the island is owned by this conservation group. And they have committed to maintaining the island in its natural state. Of course, this is a natural state that didn't exist for about the last 150 or so years, even more, almost 200 years, because for most of that time, it was actually inhabited, it was farmed, it was turned into a recreational space, it was a cottage haven in this city. So it has a very, very rich layered history, human history, but now it's essentially been reclaimed by nature. And so what you see at Kettle Island are things like ducks and frogs. And these are some of the pictures I took on the day when I was touring around, one of the days when I was touring around Kettle Island, trying to essentially soak up the atmosphere of the place for the story I was writing. And so the first piece I actually wrote about Kettle Island involved an interesting situation, which is that parts of the Gatineau shoreline have been identified as important potential habitat or actual habitat for the western chorus frog. And that is actually going to complicate any move that might occur in terms of building a bridge across Kettle Island. In case you're wondering what the chorus frog looks like, that's it. It's tiny. It's not much bigger than your fingernail. And it's a well-known species, though, because it has a very distinctive kind of croaking sound that a lot of people describe as the sound of spring. And I wish I had, I should have teed it up on my phone to let you hear the sound, but it's often described as running your finger along the teeth of a comb. You can imagine that sound. And that's what a chorus frog's call in the springtime is like. So this is a very threatened species in Ontario and Quebec. And in fact, there was a significant case in the sort of greater Montreal area over the last few years where a major redevelopment was stopped. And it's created all kinds of court cases and whatnot, lawsuits, but stopped because of the presence of the western chorus frog. And so this is a threatened species that can complicate any kind of development, including probably infrastructure like bridge building. Although the federal government has a lot of a lot of power when it comes to making things happen, as you'll hear when Phil Jenkins talks about LeBreton Flats in the coming months. So where am I here? So I wrote about the fact that that since 2013, two things have happened. The Western chorus frog has been identified as being within the vicinity of Kettle Island, and the Nature Conservancy of Canada has obtained provincial nature reserve status for the island. So even though in 2013 Kettle Island was identified as the best bridge conduit, that may get more complicated because of the environmental concerns that have emerged in the last 7 years. And there he is again, she. Okay, so this is the piece I ended up writing for the Ottawa Citizen. There are a few facts I just wanted to remind myself to say, which is why I flashed this up here. It's unofficially anyway, 3.7 kilometers long, which is pretty phenomenal. The third largest city third largest island in the entire Ottawa River system, which is over 1,000 kilometers long. So that's pretty significant. It is today primarily, if you go there, you better have some insect repellent, and you better wear long pants unless you want to get poison ivy rash all over your legs. Because that's really what it's most notable for right now. There's other things about this island which are important environmentally. It's a pretty rare combination of tree species. My friend and many of you will know, Dan Brunton, a local ecologist, has written extensively about Kettle Island and its significance and its natural history. And it is a place to go for fish scientists, because there's a lot of fish life and spawning and so forth in that vicinity, and also bird enthusiasts are drawn to Kettle Island. Kettle Island happens to be, I don't mention this elsewhere in the slides, but it happens to be the last place in Ottawa that the passenger pigeon was observed in the late 1800s. By the early 20th century, the passenger pigeon, as you guys will all know, was extinct. It's kind of a poster animal for extinction. Kettle Island was, it was a natural spot in the 19th century, even though it was inhabited. And so the passenger pigeon was last witnessed at that space. Yeah, these are a few more of the lines I borrowed from the story I wrote, and I just wanted again to capture some of this because here's really what got me interested in this place. Very few people have ever been to Kettle Island, even though it's right in the middle of our city. And there's this fascinating history. For a period of time, there was something like Disney World on Kettle Island. It was the place young kids and families were brought to have summer fun. It's also a place where cottagers for many, many generations, in fact, enjoyed their summers. And it also has an interesting connection to stories about heartrending tragedy and acts of courage, rescues of people in and around Kettle Island. Here's the other part of the story. This was, as is all of the territory, around the national capital. This is unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And there is a significant connection to, in a way, the story of colonialism and dispossession of Indigenous people in the Ottawa area that's connected to Kettle Island. And I'm going to talk about that. And I mentioned it in the story I wrote in October as well. So when you are driving along the shore of, on the Gatineau side, you will encounter this sign that is pointing out essentially toward Kettle Island. For a period of time, Kettle Island was better known as Belle Isle. And you'll see that there's going to be references to Belle Isle elsewhere in my presentation. What struck me about this sign, which captures some of the history from about the 1820s onward, is that it references, the use of the island as a farming space, as a recreational space, and as a cottage haven in the 20th century. And finally, its sort of inundation after the building of the Carillon Dam that I mentioned earlier. But it doesn't mention anything about the fact that Indigenous people were here for 8,000, 7,000 years before that. And don't forget, Kettle Island is located just downstream from the mouth of the Gatineau River. So you've got a huge island, essentially at the intersection of the Ottawa River, the Gatineau River, and not far away, the Rideau River. And so obviously, Kettle Island was a well-known place to many, 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 many generations of Indigenous people in this area. And so it strikes me as a tremendous oversight for a plaque erected, in this case, I think, by either the city of Gatineau or the province of Quebec. It looks like both. I can see the insignias down there at the bottom of the picture. Not to reference the fact that Indigenous people whose livelihoods, whose transportation was all hooked into the river system. But we see this a lot in local history, where, the story essentially begins around 1820 or 1800 when either Philemon Wright or Colonel By arrive, as if there is no preceding history that extends back millennia. I think that point needs to be made strongly when we talk about Kettle Island. And really, when we talk about any of the history of Ottawa, we need to remember that history began way before the first farmers or the first canal builders happened to, arrive at the scene. When I wrote that story in October, I brought into the story, Chief Luc Antoine Paquinawatik, who is such a significant figure in 19th century Ottawa history, but of course, none of us really know his name. But he was a leader of the Algonquin people in this region. And what happened is that in the 1830s or so, there was a bid by some local people who wanted to have farming rights on Kettle Island, to basically transfer a lease that had previously been in place. And that lease involved a settler paying money to the Algonquin people to inhabit the island and farm it, and to have livestock there and so forth. And what happened is that in 1839, the Executive Council of Lower Canada made a decision that Indigenous people did not have the right to charge rent on lands that they had occupied or had controlled for thousands of years, or at least hundreds of years in terms of the current Indigenous nations around the Ottawa area. So in principle, basically, this decision ended hundreds of years of practice in which Indigenous people had controlled the traffic along the Ottawa River. And it was this moment, actually, that kind of created a momentum towards the Algonquin communities being established on the Quebec side and on the Ontario side, at Pikwakanagan and Kitigan-Zibi. And so Kettle Island and this decision that was made in 1839 is actually part of that story. And you can see from this document that exists, there's a decision that says the Indians, excuse the terminology, the Indians have no right to grant leases or dispose of the lands situated within their ancient hunting grounds. You can't get a better summation of what dispossession means than the lines that you see in this document. So I mean, we live today and we have a greater understanding of the impacts of colonialism, but it's amazing that this island, captures a moment in that story so vividly. So, a lot of people ask, well, did Indigenous people occupy the island? I don't necessarily think that's a truly significant question, because my feeling is that this entire region was occupied effectively by Indigenous people going back thousands of years. But nevertheless, there was an archaeological study done in 2008. It was connected to a bridge proposal at the time. Don't forget, the bridge proposal has come and gone many times. So yes, 2013, yes, 2020, but also in 2008, there was a push to build the bridge across. The archaeological study involved digging down 2 trenches, or 2 or 3, maybe more, trenches on the island. It did not reveal any indications of an ancient, prehistoric Indigenous presence. But of course, there were lots of indications in terms of the research that there would have been Indigenous presence on the island. But in my own research about Kettle Island, and I've done this before, where I kind of dig around in old newspapers looking for clues about archaeological discoveries in the past. And newspapers are often a kind of a forgotten source of knowledge about not just archaeology, lots of different aspects of our history. Because newspapers are kind of ephemeral. They come and they go, but they capture a lot of information that now, because of digitization, you can go back and find things that a lot of even scholars have not discovered in the past. So I tripped across a story from 1880 in the Globe newspaper, actually talking about Kettle Island in Ottawa, and describing a discovery of human remains, arrowheads, other objects that suggest a presence of Indigenous people, at least in the recent history, if not further back. And some years later, the Ottawa Evening Journal also referred to these discoveries in 1880, suggesting, in fact, that Kettle Island was an ancient Indigenous burial ground. So there is some evidence, in fact, of an Indigenous presence on the island, and it has essentially been lost to sort of scholarly knowledge since then. But maybe there will be a rethink after the discovery of these news articles. As of 1849, this was a map showing the division of properties on Kettle Island. As you can see, it's quite thoroughly inhabited by various people who were farming at that time. There were pigs and cattle, being kept on these farming operations. And if you look to the far left of that island, you'll see the sort of pointy tip at the west end, and that is the place where most of the action that would occur going forward was going to take place. That's the place that was sort of facing the settled part of Ottawa and Hull, the future Gatineau. And so that's where a lot of the attention is. That's where I was standing when I took that selfie and paddled over there on my canoe, was at the left end of the island, the west end. So one of the first sort of examples of someone trying to make a business out of Kettle Island that wasn't just farming was a very well-known figure in Ottawa history, and that's Detective Edward O'Neill. He is sort of preluding, I guess, to James Powell's presentation next spring. He's the detective who was at the forefront of investigating Darcy McGee's murder in 1868 in Ottawa. Detective O'Neill later became a detective with the precursor of today's RCMP, but he still lived in Ottawa after taking on that job with the Dominion Police. And he lived at least part of the time every year on Kettle Island. I think it was actually his main residence. And he lived on that west end of the island that I was just referring to. And his dream was basically retiring from police work and creating a recreational hotspot at that western end of the island. And this essentially an advertisement from the late 1870s is from the Illustrated Guide to the House of Commons and Senate, which I guess was a hot publication that you wanted to get some mention in. And E.J. O'Neill is referring to his Island Park dream that he is beginning to establish at that time in the late 1870s. And he purchased a boat that he would ferry over several dozen people, I think, at a time. I'm not quite sure what the capacity of it was. It wasn't a huge boat, but it was enough to kind of bring across people who wanted to stay. And as I see, there's a description up there, play croquet on the lawns, enjoy beautiful picnicking. There was good swimming in the area that people considered pretty safe, although you'll see it wasn't always very safe. Anyway, a significant figure from Ottawa history who ends up trying to open a resort, essentially, on Kettle Island. As it happens, Detective O'Neill's daughter becomes kind of world famous because she's living at the O'Neill residence at the tip of Kettle Island and ends up becoming this amazing hero figure, a heroine of Kettle Island, as it's described here in a headline from the Toronto World in the 1880s. On several occasions, she identifies people either while drowning, either in the wintertime or in the summertime. Sometimes it's people who have overturned their boat. In another instance, it's a wonderful description of, I mean, tragic and scary, of a man riding his team of horses and carriage across the ice and goes into a hole in the river. And on successive occasions, Emily O'Neill comes to the rescue, sometimes with one of her siblings sort of dragged along, but in summer and winter, in cases where people are either swimming or boating or skating, Emily O'Neill runs to the rescue. And it's not just once. Have a look at, a whole bunch of news articles over the years. 2 brave girls saved 7 lives. Miss O'Neill, daughter of the Superintendent O'Neill of the Dominion Police Force, rescued a man, woman, boy, and team of horses from drowning on the Ottawa River. I don't know how she rescued a team of horses, but she certainly was given credit for rescuing the family in this instance. Ottawa, the city of Ottawa and others pushed for Emily O'Neill, who's, late teens, early 20s during her heroine heyday. They pushed to have her recognized by the Humane Society, which is where bravery was recognized in the 19th century and on into the 20th century. This is actually a reference to Emily in Harper's Magazine, out of the United States in 1885. It's a story about Ottawa, but one of the highlights is Emily O'Neill, who is described as the Canadian Grace Darling. Grace Darling was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper in England in the 1830s, who gained worldwide fame for rescuing shipwreck survivors off the north coast of England, maybe Scotland. No, it was England, the northernmost part of England. So anyway, there was this woman who's very little known, even after the 1930s in Ottawa, but it's quite a story. And I looked everywhere for a photo of Emily O'Neill, and I couldn't find one for the story I wrote for the Citizen. But that's a good that would be a good bit of sleuthing for somebody to come up with a picture of this heroine. Oh, and there it is again. She's receiving a prize for her bravery. There is a sadder story about attempted rescues off of Kettle Island. And many people who are listening to me right now will recognize this statue of Sir Galahad on Parliament Hill. It tells the story of the bravery of a young public servant who in the year 1901 perished when he attempted to rescue a fellow skater who had fallen through the ice off of Kettle Island. Henry Harper was the young man. Bessie Blair, who was the daughter of a federal cabinet minister, is the woman who went under, who fell through the ice. And Henry Harper leapt in, obviously risking his own life to try and save her. As it turns out, they both drowned, Bessie Blair and Henry Harper. It was big news. It was big news partly because she was the daughter of a cabinet minister. And it was big news because Henry Harper's act of heroism caught everyone's attention. And Henry Harper happened to be the best friend at the time of a young public servant whose name was Mackenzie King. And it was Mackenzie King who spearheaded the effort to create this statue and place it at Parliament Hill, right in front of the House of Commons, right in front of the Peace Tower, basically. And so it is a landmark in Ottawa that is connected to Kettle Island, and not too many people know the, the geographical connection essentially to the island, but a lot of people will know the story of Henry Harper and his attempted rescue of Bessie Blair. So in the 1890s, there were other attempts after E.J. O'Neill to try and create a resort on Kettle Island. The Laverdure family was very active in the 1890s. They owned the property that E.J. O'Neill had owned in the 1870s and 1880s. There were events like this big Saint Jean Baptiste Day gathering on the island. It was considered one of the great park spaces in Ottawa and Gatineau at the time, Hull, as it was known, of course. And you can see, this gala day was being planned. There was going to be a baseball match. There was obviously a ferry that was transporting people at various times throughout the 1890s to Kettle Island. And even in the 1890s, as you can see from this advertisement on the left, there was a hotel built on the grounds, and boats were leaving regularly to drop people off to enjoy the surroundings of the island. All kinds of other activities happening, amusements, aerial railway. Somebody's going to have to tell me what that is. It might be an early roller coaster, but it's typical of what was happening on Kettle Island for so many decades. This place that is now nothing but bush was a go-to green space in Ottawa Hull throughout many decades. I read one example. This is just another advertisement about that 1892 Saint Jean Baptiste Day, but there was an advertisement that there were 4,000 people gathered on Kettle Island for, I think it was either a Saint Jean Baptiste event or a Dominion Day gathering. But you can imagine, like, that's a huge crowd in the 1890s in this city. The kind of thing that would have rivaled any gathering on Parliament Hill. So Kettle Island was part of people's consciousness, and it was really kind of a go-to place. So then what happened is that, I better check my clock here. Oh yeah, I'm getting pretty, okay, so I better hurry it up. But in 1912, that was the next big push to create even more excitement around Kettle Island. And this is the era when it became known as Belle Isle. A company purchased the island and was selling lots, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, for anywhere between $100 and $450. depending on the location and the size of the lots. This was being billed as the perfect retreat for Ottawa and Hull businessmen, to get away from their cares, to bring the family over and connect with nature, Ottawa's beauty spot. It was considered a great place for picnics, for recreational swimming, for boating, etc. And so there was a lot of building up in the newspapers at the time about this brand new development on Kettle Island. And it was paired with an amusement park that was hailed as the Coney Island of Ottawa. There was a new hotel that was built at the site. There was an auditorium, a concert hall and theater, all in that building on the right. You can see in the advertisement. It was going to be an entertainment hotspot as well as a sporting space, because they were creating a new baseball diamond, boxing rings. There was, sort of more disgusting things like cockfights that were frequent on Kettle Island at the time. But this whole thing was built around the idea that it was like, it was going to be a recreational hotspot, but at the same time, it was kind of tied in to a real estate scheme where they would sell all these lots to local businessmen, and then their families would kind of migrate to the west end of the island where all this action was happening throughout the summer. And so it was built up to be a very kind of, significant new development in Ottawa. And of course, as part of that, there was a boat purchased, a steamboat purchased to become the ferry that would bring people constantly from Ottawa to the island. This is the ferry. It was purchased from service on Lake Ontario. There were newspaper stories about how the guys who were behind the Kettle Island scheme went down to Napanee to get the boat and bring it to Montreal and then up to Ottawa along the river. And there was a lot of excitement. But look at the date, May 1912. Some of you will know that earlier in 1912, just a month earlier, something pretty devastating happened in the world, and that was the sinking of the Titanic. And so just as there was all this excitement building around Kettle Island and the idea that this wonderful new ferry would be taking people out to Kettle Island, the news of the sinking of the Titanic made everybody petrified of going on boats. And you can tell that that's true because in the Ottawa Citizen story about the arrival of the steamboat to the city, there's this very detailed description of the life jackets and the lifeboats that are available on the Quincy Queen, which is what this steamboat was called. I'll read it. The Quincy Queen is fitted up with more than a sufficient supply of life-saving apparatus for the number of passengers it will carry, having 3 lifeboats in addition to hundreds of life belts. You can just see that the schemers behind Kettle Island were falling all over themselves to reassure the locals that they weren't going to drown on the way to Kettle Island. So the timing couldn't have been worse for a resort that required people to jump on a boat to get there. Nevertheless, Belle Isle Park was launched. Ottawa's Coney Island, a merry-go-round vaudeville show, etc. Great picnic spot, all kinds of special events. The idea was for summer picnics for, labor unions and for sports teams and others to actually congregate on Kettle Island to spend the summer. I think there's a really touching story here. Rocco Graziadi was a very well-known musician in Ottawa in the sort of turn of the century era. And for a moment, a sort of a brief shining moment, Rocco Graziadi and his huge family of children, all of whom played musical instruments. Rocco was well known for being a fantastic harpist, but he was an orchestra leader. But he obviously had an opportunity with the development of Kettle Island to become much more than just a musician for hire. He was sort of the entertainment impresario of Kettle Island. He was the guy who was booking acts for the entertainment venue on Kettle Island. He was booking the films that were being shown at the moving picture theater. And so there was a moment in the summer of 1912 when this immigrant, one of the earliest Italian immigrants to Ottawa, was emerging as the city's entertainment guru. You can see some of the ads from the newspapers. This is prior to his emergence as the Kettle Island impresario. There were other things happening on Kettle Island, like I said, major sporting events all throughout the summer of 1912. And then there's this, and I need to just sort of pause and explain that this is a particularly disturbing part of the history, but I feel like it's important to expose this and maybe even begin a discussion about sort of racism in Ottawa's past. One of the entertainments, as it was described at the time, in and amongst things like the shooting gallery and the merry-go-round and the other stuff that you could do on Kettle Island, was something called Hit the Person and Get a Cigar. This was a racist carnival game that was actually very popular throughout North America at the time. I've blocked out the word that describes exactly what the game was. But it's well known. It's been studied by historians. It's better known probably as the African Dodger Carnival game. And what it was that there was essentially a tarp with a hole cut in the middle, and a Black person had their head sticking out of this tarp. And people paid money to be able to throw baseballs. I think you got 3 baseballs for a nickel probably, or something like that. And the game was to try and hit the person. And the person who was, coerced or volunteered to be, and possibly paid to be the person, the target, would be able to move their head to avoid being hit by the ball. But there are examples of people being hit and very badly hurt. And this wasn't the only example of this game being played in Ottawa in this era. I actually found an old newspaper story about a church picnic where this game was being played. So this is a year of reckoning on race issues. A lot of looking back at things like historical landmarks and thinking about the sort of embedded racism of a city's history. And this is, I think, one of the most disturbing examples of that. I mean, to us today, it's an unthinkable thing. But this was a very common game right into the middle 20th century in the United States. And I just felt that I couldn't talk about the island and this moment when it was sort of billed as Coney Island without confronting the fact that this was also happening. And it says something about the society in the early 20th century. As it turns out, Belle Isle, the big scheme, real estate scheme and entertainment scheme, did not last very long, because here's the bankruptcy notice in 1913, 1 year after the big launch. In fact, the place does sputter along for a few years, I guess in receivership or something like that. But you can see that they specifically mention things like, the Quincy Queen, the boat is, maybe it's not in this slide, but it's been seized. Oh yeah, it is there. This is all part of, the bankruptcy trustee has taken possession of all of the property, all of the buildings, the ferry that was bringing people to the island. It's all now basically in bankruptcy. And there are 260 lots as you can see from the right-hand side, which have been caught up in this legal drama. So obviously a lot of people did purchase property or were about to purchase property and maybe gave significant funds to the schemers, but in fact, the place did not survive. So there were a few years where it, under a different name, it did sort of persist as a recreational place, but essentially what happened was that big dream of Coney Island on Ottawa's Kettle Island didn't really end up persisting beyond a year. By 1921, there is a court battle over not the boat, the Quincy Queen, but its wreck, because it's now wrecked off of one of the shores of Kettle Island. And so there was a battle between two different people who thought they had rights to salvage stuff from the sunken boat. It's not the only shipwreck off of the island, but it's, I guess, probably the best known because of its association with that 1912 event. So over the years that followed, Kettle Island had a few moments in the sun. I'm not sure this is a moment that is a happy one, but it was in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. There was as there often were at that time, scenarios that were played out. And in this particular simulation, the idea was that an atomic bomb had gone off above Kettle Island. And this was a way for emergency officials in Ottawa and Hull to test how well the community would respond if the Soviet Union happened to launch a missile at Ottawa, because of course it was a capital of the I guess adversary nations during the Cold War, and so it would have been targeted. That's why we have the Diefenbunker in Carp. But this kind of simulation took place, and in this particular instance, it was all built around the idea of a bomb, an atomic bomb going off over Kettle Island. As I mentioned, in the 1960s, the Carillon Dam was built, and that created a much higher level of water in the Ottawa River upstream, and that made it impossible for people to maintain cottages there. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, there were cottagers on Kettle Island. There were also a lot of mosquitoes, and the headlines that you see in the newspapers during those decades are all about the anti-mosquito campaigns, where they would have planes dumping gallons and thousands of gallons of oil on what they thought were mosquito nesting sites, including the sort of the pond in the middle of Kettle Island. So it was a pretty common place to dump anti-mosquito stuff. These are just a few more pictures. I see little bits of evidence on the island of maybe those buildings from the early 20th century. This is about all you can see now are shards of brick mixed in with the sand on the west end of the island. You can see places where it's pretty clear this was a clearing at one time. Maybe this was the baseball diamond where they had these big matches with thousands of fans. But you can see that there's forest, and then there is something that was cleared at one time. And this is the kind of site you see frequently on Kettle Island now. Traces of human presence is mostly people who had been partying. I've got other pictures where it's beer cans kind of in a fire pit. And then I'll just wind up by talking a little bit more about the bridges. I realize we got a bunch of questions, so I'm sorry, but I will very quickly wrap up. The earliest proposal for a bridge across Kettle Island was in 1888, when there was a proposed rail and passenger bridge across from sort of the Rockcliffe side across Kettle Island to the Hull side. Other schemes have been proposed. There's another one from 1959, time to have a bridge across Kettle Island. This is another one from 1915, the famous Holt Report. They refer to the good sense of building a third bridge just below the mouth of the Gatineau River. Well, the only place you'd build a bridge just below the mouth of the Gatineau River is probably Kettle Island, because it's literally just a few hundred meters below the mouth. These are just a selection of headlines demonstrating how frequently the idea of a Kettle Island bridge has come up, has come close to being built, in fact, but has then sort of faded into the background because of public opposition or other factors that prevented it from happening. I will just quickly scroll through a few of these headlines. This is getting into our time, so a lot of us will remember these moments of controversy. And now we're back at the 2013 controversy that sparked, that sort of indirectly sparked my current interest. I just point out that currently the Kettle Island is owned by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. That's the organization on the right. And it's the National Capital Commission that has frequently been pushing the idea of a Kettle Island bridge. We haven't quite got to the point of NCC versus NCC when this issue, if it ever comes to a head, but that's what it'll be. And finally, that's the headline, I think, that sums up where we stand today on Kettle Island, where it's once again a contentious issue. I think that's it.
Wow.
Sorry for running over time. Thanks for holding off, Richard. Thanks for not giving me the hook.
I'm sorry?
Thanks for not giving me the hook.
Well, we did get a lot of questions in advance, but
I see that.
Typically I would expect from you, because you've researched this thing so thoroughly, just about all the questions that were asked in advance have been answered.
That's good.
Typical for me, Randy, I expect from a journalist that you get something that was thoroughly researched and presented in such a concise and ordered manner. So thank you for that tonight. I do have a couple of questions here that have been sent in. Actually, the first one, I guess you did talk about the shipwrecks. Although it does say, can the remains of the Quincy Queen still be seen?
It's a great question. I do not know for sure. It's not the only one. There was another shipwreck in the 1860s, I'm going to say. And that was a ship that was moving along the Gatineau shore, between the shore and the island. And I have it somewhere. And I know John Savage had a couple of questions about this, and I should dig that one out, because there is a record of a shipwreck of a ship that went down. It ran aground in the 19th century, and in the 1960s or 70s, there was an effort to explore that wreck. And I've seen a newspaper clipping of that effort. So I'll dig that out too and provide that to whoever is interested in the wrecks.
Yeah, okay, I got a couple questions from John here.
Yeah.
Have you any information on Paul Charette and his father, who are said to be the last licensed trappers and fishermen in the area?
I don't. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned you have any information on a family camp on the island.
Well, there were lots of, there were stories beginning in the 1870s and going right through to the 1950s about camping on the island. It was a major place for people who snowshoed. It was a destination for the Ottawa Snowshoe Club, and people who know about sports history in the Ottawa area know that the Snowshoe Club was very significant in developing trails and green spaces. They are interwoven into the story of the birth of Gatineau Park. And so Kettle Island was, I guess, originally an easy place to get to, especially in winter, because you could go across the ice, as people did then when there was less I guess, caution about falling through. Anyway, there were lots of camping and recreational stories about Kettle Island throughout the many generations.
Okay, and I just have one last question, but before I get to that last question, we do have an answer to one of the questions you asked. The picture of the odd-looking thing that's hanging from the tree, we got the suggestion that it might be the base of the swing. So
Okay.
the one that you think, and now that I try and picture it, that might be what it is. And finally, the last question is, are there any trails, or maybe added to that, even if there are trails, is access to the island discouraged?
Yes, access is not only discouraged, it's not permitted. However, the Nature Conservancy has made an exception, and they've actually made it semi-public, I'd say. They allow people to pull up their canoes or their watercraft onto the West End beach and have a picnic. They allow, there's another beach on the south-facing side of the island, which is actually a bit of a larger, well, I'd say it's a larger space. That is where the sign is that I showed a picture of, showing that it's a nature reserve. But the sign itself says something like, you know, you're not permitted to go beyond the sandy beach area, and please clean up after yourself. So they are clearly tolerating people sort of, you know, hanging out there. But you're not really supposed to be wandering inside the forest, because it's a nature reserve. I did sneakily wander a little bit. There are no trails that I can find. It's not easy to move around inside the island. It's a thick space. It's thick bush, and the bugs are bad, and there is poison ivy everywhere. So it's not a hospitable place to go. I did see, oddly, 2 wild turkeys who I assumed must have come across in the winter. I don't know how else they would have. They don't fly. They don't fly very far anyway. So anyway, that was a kind of an interesting sighting when I was canoeing around the island. But mostly it is just frogs and whatever else is running around in the bush.
Okay, well, that's it for questions, Randy. The only thing I want to make mention of before we wrap up is, if you get a chance, take a look at the chat. Obviously, a lot of people have a lot of passion for the subject, as much as you do. So there's a lot of people that have been talking about this. So take a look at the conversation going on there, and hopefully we can answer some more questions on Kettle Island.
Would it be possible to make a couple of comments?
Sure. Who is this? That's
Mike Anderchak.
Okay, yeah.
I was intrigued by the subject of Kettle Island because back in 1974-75, I was an auditor with the Auditor General of Canada, and I was looking at some maps at the National Capital Commission that we were auditing, and I saw a map that showed a proposed bridge over Kettle Island. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I looked at the date of the map. The date of the map was 1890 something.
Yeah.
So as you pointed out, Randy, this is not a new proposal in terms of a bridge. The second point I'd like to make is that I really appreciate some of the sensitive sides of the story that you relayed with respect to Indigenous peoples and the lack of the mention of Indigenous peoples with respect to Kettle Island. I think that has to happen a lot more around the city with a number of the other islands as well. Thanks for.
Yeah, in fact, I've just got one last question I think I'm going to ask you, Randy. Obviously, the research you've done on this is way more than 4,000 word article. I see a book in there. Am I opening up a can of worms and suggesting that we might find a book on Kettle Island in the future? I'm sure.
Well, I'm not the first researcher to sort of tackle it either. There's a French language PhD dissertation that looks at a lot of this history as well, but it didn't, in a sense, find a popular outlet. And there's been sporadic other research about the subject, but I think there's definitely room to use Kettle Island. In fact, much the same way that help me, much the same way that Phil Jenkins has researched LeBreton Flats. You know, when you look at a piece of land in a major urban area like this, and you drill down, through its history and through its many layers of history, you're going to find interesting evolution of that space. What's particularly interesting, I think, about Kettle Island is, and I barely even touched on it, it has a very interesting natural history. I mean, how it was formed, goes back to, the deglaciation of this part of North America. And so it's a really interesting, this alluvial island is itself a very interesting object. But the human history, beginning with Indigenous people and then following through everything that's happened since, tells a lot about the history of the city. And so you can kind of, it's a capsule history of the entire city in many ways. And the fact that we continue to have arguments essentially over whether or not to build this bridge across the place is, it just offers so many opportunities to intersect with all of those layers of history.
Okay, thanks, Randy. I think we're going to wrap things up now because we've answered our questions, but I want to thank you again. Whoops. Do we have something else?
I see John, a question.
I'd like to make a point. I've done a lot of canoe guiding there, and I've taken people from other cities like Vancouver and Toronto to the island, and you stand on Duvel Point and you get this feeling when you're up on the little bluff there looking out that this is a place where humans have been for thousands of years. And it makes a really good encampment because you can keep an eye on the river because this was a nexus for Indigenous people for Eastern North America. And so in friendly times, it was good to see who's coming down the river to trade. And in times of war, it was a place where you could have a strategic position to see if the enemy was coming. But the other thing too is like people who come to our city, they just marvel when they're standing there or swimming because it's like a jewel in the middle of our national capital region. It's a piece of nature. You don't have to go hundreds of kilometers away to feel what it must have been like in the old days. And it would be a tragedy, an absolute tragedy if we ever lost this to a bridge because the NCC was saying that they would have to clear cut the first 300 meters of the island and those tall towering poplars there, North American poplars would be gone and it would be desecrated forever. And, so I did a lot of lobbying behind the scenes on this. That's a whole other story. It's quite interesting. But I think if people have a chance, you should get out, canoe to Duvel Point, first of all, and just get a sense of what it's like to stand under those giant North American poplars. They're the largest poplars in the world. So that's my recommendation. And if anybody wants to take me up on going there sometime, I can get access to big canoes and take out the group if they want. So.
Wow. Oh, well, boy, a historical society outing.
Yeah.
Piling into canoes.
There you go. Yeah.
John, thanks a lot for some of your correspondence too. I've appreciated it.
Okay. Yeah, and some great chat also I want to mention too from John and others. So thanks for everyone who participated tonight. And thanks for everyone for listening in. I just want to make one last announcement that our next online meeting will be January 13th, 2021. And that is, our speaker will be Emma Kent, and she'll be talking about Camp Woolsey, 80 years of lifelong friendship and memories. So I hope you can join us for that meeting. And until then, everyone have happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Hey, Lynn, can you leave the thing running for a minute just so I can look through the chat?
Yes, I'm going to stop the recording though.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, everybody.